12,300 years ago, on a marshy flat in what is now the Utah desert, a small group of hunter-gatherers sat around a fire and did something that archaeologists didn't expect to find evidence of for another 9,000 years. They inhaled smoke from a plant purely because of how it made them feel. Not for food, not for warmth, for the exact same reason someone lights up outside a bar today. And by the end of this video, you're going to know precisely how we know that, what plant it was, how the habit spread to completely different continents independently, and one surprising connection between ancient smoking rituals and modern funerals that most people have never heard of. So let's go back to that fireplace in the desert, because the story starts with four tiny, burnt seeds that almost got thrown away. In 2021, archaeologists excavating a site called Wishbone out in Utah's Great Salt Lake Desert uncovered the remains of an ancient hearth. Around it were stone tools, waterfowl bones, and spear tips, the ordinary debris of a hunting camp near the end of the Ice Age. But mixed into the charred wood of the fireplace itself were four small seeds. When researchers identified them, they turned out to belong to a species of wild tobacco called Nicotiana attenuata. That alone wouldn't be surprising, except for one detail. That specific patch of marshland wasn't a place where wild tobacco actually grew. Someone had to carry those seeds in from somewhere else, likely from foothills over 8 miles away, and then burn them at a fireside gathering. The researchers also ruled out the seeds being used simply as fuel, since tobacco seeds don't burn particularly well for that purpose, which leaves one clear explanation. These hunter-gatherers were deliberately using tobacco, likely smoking or chewing it for its intoxicating effect, at least 12,300 years ago. That single discovery didn't just answer an old question, it completely rewrote the timeline. Before this find, the oldest confirmed evidence of human tobacco use came from ceramic pipes discovered in Alabama, containing nicotine residue roughly 3,300 years old. For decades, that was considered the starting point. The Utah discovery didn't just push the date back a little, it pushed it back 9,000 years, all the way to the tail end of the last ice age, long before agriculture, long before writing, long before almost anything we'd recognize as civilization existed anywhere on Earth. Which raises an obvious question. If humans have been deliberately inhaling psychoactive smoke since the Ice Age, why did it take archaeologists so long to find any evidence of it? The answer is almost frustratingly simple. Seeds and burnt plant matter are incredibly fragile, and they only survive in very specific conditions. Most ancient smoking evidence would have decomposed completely within a few centuries, let alone 12,000 years. The only reason the Utah seeds survived is that they were charred just enough to become chemically stable, then sealed inside dry desert sediment that protected them from the elements for over 12 millennia. In other words, this habit is probably far older than even this discovery suggests. We've simply been looking at the tip of a much larger, much older iceberg, and every new excavation has a real chance of pushing the timeline back even further. Now, here's where the story gets genuinely strange, because tobacco wasn't the only plant ancient humans were setting on fire for its effects, and it wasn't even limited to one part of the world. Roughly 10,000 years after that Utah campfire, on the opposite side of the planet, an entirely different group of people were doing something remarkably similar with a completely different plant. In 2019, researchers analyzing wooden bowls from an ancient burial site called Jiazankal Cemetery, high in the Pamir Mountains of what is now western China, made a discovery that rewrote a different timeline entirely. The cemetery dates back roughly 2,500 years, and among the burials, archaeologists found 10 wooden braziers, small burners that once held heated stones. Chemical analysis of the charred residue inside 9 of those braziers revealed something unmistakable: cannabis, and not just any cannabis. The chemical signature showed unusually high levels of THC, the psychoactive compound responsible for cannabis's mind-altering effects, significantly higher than typical wild cannabis of that era. That detail matters enormously because it suggests these weren't just wild plants people happened to gather. Someone appears to have been deliberately selecting or cultivating cannabis plants specifically for their psychoactive strength thousands of years before anyone wrote down the concept of selective breeding. And the context in which this cannabis was being burned adds another layer entirely. These braziers weren't found in ordinary living spaces. They were found inside tombs, buried alongside the dead, concentrated specifically in the more elaborate, higher status burials at the site. Researchers believe mourners gathered around these braziers during funeral rites, inhaling the smoke together in an enclosed space, likely as part of an attempt to communicate with the spirit world or with the dead themselves. Before you assume this was some isolated regional practice, consider the location. Jirzankal sat directly along early trade routes that would eventually become part of the Silk Road, and isotope analysis of the buried skeletons found that nearly a third of the people buried there had grown up somewhere else entirely. This wasn't an isolated tribe with one strange local custom. It was a crossroads where different cultures were converging, and deliberate cannabis smoking for ritual and psychoactive purposes was apparently common enough to become part of funeral tradition. It's worth pausing on exactly how researchers can look at a charred smear inside a 2,000-year-old wooden bowl and confidently say that was cannabis, because the method itself is fairly remarkable. Scientists use a technique called gas chromatography mass spectrometry, which essentially vaporizes a tiny sample of ancient residue, separates it into its individual chemical components, and then identifies each one by comparing it against known chemical signatures. It's the same basic principle used in modern forensic labs, just aimed backward in time instead of at a crime scene. This is precisely how the Jurzankal braziers were confirmed to contain cannabis with unusually high THC content, rather than ordinary hemp, and it's the same category of analysis that confirmed nicotine inside that ancient Mayan flask. Without this kind of chemistry, all archaeologists would have to go on is guesswork based on shape and context. With it, a burnt smear that looks like nothing more than ash can be turned into hard, specific proof of exactly what ancient people were burning, and by extension, exactly what they wanted to feel. If you're wondering whether these two discoveries, the Utah tobacco seeds and the Chinese cannabis braziers, are somehow connected, they're not, at least not directly. They're separated by roughly 10,000 years and an ocean, and that's actually the most important detail in this entire story, so let that sink in for a second, because we're about to look at a third, completely separate origin point on a third continent. Halfway around the world from both of those sites, an entirely different civilization was developing its own elaborate relationship with smoking, and this time we don't just have chemical residue, we have actual pictures. At the ancient Maya site of Palenque in what is now Mexico, a carved stone panel inside the Temple of the Cross depicts a figure smoking what appears to be an ornate pipe, direct visual evidence carved in stone of a smoking ritual. Maya mythology went even further. The Popol Vuh, the sacred narrative text of the Quiche Maya, describes two hero figures who were ordered to keep cigars burning through an entire night inside a cave of darkness, as a trial set by the lords of the underworld. According to the story, the heroes cleverly fooled their captors by attaching fireflies to the ends of unlit cigars, faking the glow of a lit smoke to survive the night. That's not just evidence that the Maya smoked, it's evidence that smoking had become significant enough to embed itself directly into their religious mythology, treated as something powerful enough to matter in a story about outsmarting the gods of death themselves. The chemistry backs up the mythology here too. In a separate discovery, researchers identified traces of nicotine inside a Mayan ceramic flask roughly 1,300 years old, confirming what the carvings and the Popol Vuh had already strongly implied. And when Spanish colonizers arrived in the 16th century and encountered Maya communities directly, they documented in their own written accounts watching local people smoking rolled tobacco, essentially describing cigars centuries before that word entered European vocabulary. Three separate cultures, three separate continents, three separate plants, one shared, deeply human impulse, gathering around something burning, breathing in the smoke, and using that experience to alter how you feel, connect with each other, or reach towards something beyond the ordinary world. There's also a more recent chapter of this story that helps bridge the ancient evidence to something more familiar. By the time Europeans encountered the Americas, indigenous cultures across North and South America had already developed centuries, and in some cases thousands of years, of complex ritual tobacco use, often tied to diplomacy, healing, and formal ceremony, rather than casual, everyday habit. Ancestral Puebloan communities in what is now Arizona were chewing tobacco somewhere between 1 and 2,000 years ago, a practice sitting neatly on the long timeline between that original Ice Age fireside and the present day. This matters because it shows the story isn't just ancient humans discovered smoking and then modern people separately reinvented it. It's closer to an unbroken thread, stretching from that first campfire in the Utah desert through thousands of years of indigenous ceremonial tradition into the era of European contact and eventually into the mass-produced cigarettes lining convenience store shelves today. The context, the meaning, and the plants themselves have shifted dramatically. The underlying human behavior has barely changed at all. Tobacco and cannabis aren't even the only two plants in this story either. Long before either of those discoveries, a third psychoactive plant was already deeply embedded in human life on the opposite side of Eurasia. Opium poppy seeds and seed pods have been recovered from Neolithic lake village sites in Switzerland, and intact poppy capsules were found inside a religious artifact at a cave site in southern Spain, dated to roughly 5,500 years before the Common Era. That places deliberate human interaction with the opium poppy squarely inside the Neolithic period, the same broad era when humans across the world were first experimenting with permanent settlements and early agriculture. To be clear, historians still debate exactly how ceremonial or how medicinal these specific early uses were, since poppy seeds were also a genuine food source, and that ambiguity is honestly part of what makes this kind of archaeology so difficult. But the placement of poppy remains inside what appears to be a religious or ceremonial context in Spain suggests these particular seeds weren't simply somebody's dinner. This raises a genuinely interesting question that researchers are still actively trying to answer. If tobacco use goes back over 12,000 years and cannabis smoking goes back at least 2,500, and completely separate civilizations on different continents all independently arrived at the idea of inhaling plant smoke for its psychoactive effect, what does that tell us about the human brain itself? One leading idea is that early humans functioned as, in the words of one archaeologist involved in the tobacco research, the ultimate botanists, rapidly identifying which plants around them produced altered states, and doing so again and again across completely unconnected populations with no shared knowledge or contact between them. That's a remarkable pattern. It suggests this wasn't a single lucky discovery that happened to spread. It was something closer to an inevitability baked into how curious, pattern-seeking human minds interact with the plants in their environment. All of this raises a question that's easy to skip past. Why smoke a plant at all instead of just eating it? The answer comes down to basic human biology, and it's a piece of the puzzle almost nobody thinks about when they picture ancient humans huddled around a fire. When a psychoactive compound is swallowed, it has to survive digestion, pass through the stomach and intestines, and get filtered through the liver before it ever reaches the bloodstream in meaningful concentration, a process that can take 20 minutes or more, and one that breaks down a significant portion of the active compound before it does anything at all. Inhaling smoke skips nearly all of that. The lungs are lined with an enormous surface area of extremely thin tissue, sitting directly next to a dense network of blood vessels, which means inhaled compounds can enter the bloodstream in a matter of seconds and reach the brain almost immediately afterward. Ancient humans obviously had no concept of pharmacokinetics or bioavailability, but through pure trial and error repeated over countless generations, they appear to have arrived at the same basic discovery again and again, independently on different continents. Burning a plant and breathing in the smoke gets you there faster and more intensely than eating it ever could. That single, brutally practical piece of biology may be the real underlying reason smoking specifically, rather than just consuming these plants some other way, kept independently reappearing throughout deep human history. There's also a domestication angle here that's easy to miss, and it might be one of the most underrated details in this entire story. The oldest confirmed evidence of tobacco being deliberately domesticated, meaning actively cultivated and selectively bred rather than simply gathered wild, comes from South America, dating back roughly 8,000 years. That timeline places tobacco domestication remarkably close to the early domestication of food crops in the same general regions and time periods. Some researchers now argue that humanity's relationship with intoxicating plants may have shaped early agricultural practices just as significantly as our relationship with food did, meaning the domestication of pleasure, in a sense, was happening right alongside the domestication of survival. It's worth being honest about the limits of this evidence too, because a good history video shouldn't pretend archaeology is more certain than it actually is. Researchers can rarely prove with total certainty what a specific ancient person was feeling or intending when they burned a particular plant. The Utah seeds are strong circumstantial evidence, but the researchers themselves describe deliberate tobacco use as the most likely explanation, not an absolute certainty. The Jiazankal braziers give us clear chemical proof of what was burned, but the exact meaning of the ritual is still interpreted through educated inference. This uncertainty isn't a weakness in the story, it's actually part of what makes archaeology like this so compelling. Every new excavation, every improved chemical testing method has the potential to rewrite what we think we know, the same way the Utah discovery instantly rewrote 9,000 years of assumed history the moment it was published. If any of this is making you rethink what ancient history actually looked like, that's genuinely the entire reason this channel exists, digging past the assumption that early humans were simple and finding out how much of what feels distinctly modern actually goes back further than almost anyone expects. If you want more of that, hit subscribe, and let's keep going, because there's one more piece of this story that ties everything together. That piece is ritual. Across every single one of these discoveries, from the Utah hearth to the Pamir mountain tombs to the Maya temple carvings, smoking rarely appears as a purely private, solitary habit. It shows up embedded in shared, communal contexts: fireside gatherings, funeral rites, sacred storytelling. The Jiazankal braziers were specifically designed to let multiple people inhale the same smoke together in an enclosed space. The Maya myth of the cigar trial was a story told and retold within a community. Even the Utah hearth, based on the surrounding debris of tools and animal bones, appears to have been a shared cooking and gathering space rather than a solitary campsite. Smoking, from the very earliest evidence we have, wasn't simply about the chemical effect on one person's brain. It was a social technology, a shared experience used to bond groups together, mark significant moments, and create a communal, altered state that ordinary daily life didn't otherwise provide. That single insight might be the most important takeaway of this entire video. The specific plants have changed: tobacco here, cannabis there, other psychoactive substances in other regions entirely. The specific rituals have changed dramatically across cultures and centuries, but the underlying human behavior, gathering with others around something burning, deliberately altering your state of mind, and using that shared experience to mark something meaningful, appears to be remarkably old, remarkably widespread, and remarkably consistent across societies that had no contact with each other whatsoever. So the next time you see someone light a cigarette outside a bar, or smell incense burning at a ceremony, or watch smoke curl up from any kind of communal fire, understand that you're witnessing something with a lineage stretching back to the final years of the last ice age, carried forward independently by hunter gatherers in the American desert, mourners in the mountains of Central Asia, and priests inside Maya temples, none of whom ever knew the others existed, all arriving at the same fundamentally human idea. If this is the kind of history you didn't learn in school, subscribing genuinely helps more of it reach you because there's a lot more of it where this came from.